All right. Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us on the Digital Health Growth Show. Today, we are talking about navigating the payer maze, a digital health go-to-market guide. We're excited to have Mike Goodman, co-founder of Oshi, here with us to walk us through it. Chris, I know you are particularly excited about this subject, so why don't you tell us why?
I am. And how are you today, Noah? Doing well?
I'm doing all right. Rainy day here in Massachusetts. I might need to go make some popcorn and change into pajamas and watch a movie after this.
Sounds in character. Yeah, so I have, I guess, known of Mike for a while, but I actually met him relatively recently. And we've had a few conversations about this topic. And I was like, wow, this is the guy to talk to. When I say this topic, I mean, basically, you're a digital health company. You're trying to figure out your relationship with payers. You're trying to basically figure out who you are. And I was like, this guy can really lay the land here. So in those conversations we've had, I've learned a lot. This is basically a topic that I wish I knew more about 10 or so years ago. I spent some time with Verta Health, and I spent some time on Bicycle Health and working with many other digital health companies. And I'll say, like, I've seen a lot of money and time wasted on this topic. So it's basically, trying to do a lot of things at once, trying to do like direct to consumer and payer, distribution at the same time, or trying to figure out like what payer channel are you going to go through. Employers, are you going to go through health plans? You can do health plans. Are you going to sell directly? You're going to get contracts, that kind of stuff. There's just a lot of iterations that I've seen. I will also say, I think the market has matured a lot in the last 10 or 15 years. So I think Mike is showing up now with like all the wisdom of those 10 years, saying like, this is how you do things. And I think we are in a different phase right now. And so I think if you're going to start a company, there's a lot more questions that have been answered. And I think talking to Mike is the kind of person you want to talk to about answering those questions. Mm-hmm. I guess I'm curious, do you see this across your clients, like people kind of navigating these questions and how they're figuring it out?
Yeah, I mean, what I see in our client base, so we are a SEO, GEO agency. We're focused on patient acquisition for digital health brands. And so what I see is more downstream of these decisions, I think, but I see the anxiety often where, in working with us, in working with other, on their other go-to-market channels, our clients are often just working through in real time what the right approach is for them. Often it's the reason that we're hired to work with the company, and also the reason we stop working with the company is their go-to-market strategy, their model just changes in midstream, and obviously the result of that is a lot of quote unquote wasted spend or otherwise spent on learning what is actually right for them. So what was, this is not a subject area that I'm like deeply involved in my day to day. It sounds very complicated. And what I thought was impressive when we first talked to Mike was how simple it kind of sounded, despite being very complicated.
Yeah, I mean, I think he makes it sound simple, but I think it's like, this is, many years of experience put down into a few solid bullet points. Yeah, cool. Should we bring Mike in?
Yes, I've gone blurry for some reason. Let's see if that works. There we go. Let's bring Mike in. Thank you, Mike, for joining us today. Everybody say hello to Mike in the comments. And Mike, how are you doing?
I'm doing well. I'm with you, Noah. Bit of a rainy day here in New York. So I like the idea of ducking out of work and watching a movie for the rest of the day.
Yeah, okay, we'll do a movie club. It's agreed. Chris, why don't you kick us off?
Yeah. All right, Mike. So we're going to spend most of this conversation talking about this, like these, I guess I'll say types of digital health companies that you introduced me and Noah to. I think what we'll do is we'll just go through, there's 5 of them, and we'll go through them one by one. And after having this conversation with you, I think this kind of maps the space in a very concise, clean, understandable way. And I think the idea is people can leave. I guess we would like this to help people answer the question, I'm running this company, I'm deciding to start this company, or, we're scaled, but we're trying to figure out our channels. What is going to work for me? What's going to be my payer / channel / us fit question. So let's go through these 5. I think do we even have a visual of these 5 we can throw up on the screen?
Yeah, I think the team can put it up on the screen.
So this may help people as we go through. Does that sound good? Just like kicking it off through these 5 categories, or do you want to say anything first, Mike?
No, yeah, that sounds like a great intro, and I'll maybe just walk through how I view these 5 and a little bit of the history, at least as I see it, of the industry and of how we thought about it at Oshi, which is the company that I'm currently the chief growth officer of and one of the co-founders of.
Okay, cool. All right, maybe I will first say, okay, so there's 5 categories here. There's 2 that are direct to consumer. So you look at these 2 here, D2C cash pay, D2C insurance, okay? And there's 2 that are sales based. There's health plan sales and employer sales. And then there's 1 that I think is a little bit of an oddball in this mix, but billing through the provider. We can talk about that at the end. Maybe let's start with the consumer categories. Start with like, sort of maybe with some of the things like the cleanest of these, which is direct to consumer cash pay. Talk about like what kind of these companies are, like what kind of verticals this fits in, good examples, maybe some bad examples, that kind of thing.
Bad examples is a fun one. Yeah. I'll say first, if you are a digital health company, you have probably thought through most, if not all of these channels, and someone along the way, somewhere, maybe just a voice inside your head has said like, this is the one. And so I think there is a lot of, it's worth considering each of these. And ultimately there are right answers of where to start. And I think we've talked about how they're not mutually exclusive. So starting in the direct to consumer category, direct to consumer cash pay, this is basically just if you're a consumer product that needs the infrastructure of healthcare in order to sell said product. That's the way I think about it. So obviously Hims and Hers and Row are the big companies in the space. There's been plenty of others, 30 Madison, that have worked out fairly well. Obviously all the most recent GLP-1 type of companies. And this needs to be pretty simple. People need like a consumer, price point that they can relate to. When I'm buying a product, I want something pretty simple. Like I want something, this addresses my problem, pretty one-to-one. Selling like a service or a workup, or you're going to talk to a doctor, has never worked super well in the cash pay model, at least so far, because the costs end up being prohibitive and people expect it to be covered by insurance. It's changing a little bit, or at least there's hypotheses that it can change with AI, where you can get that to a consumer price point and deliver something and the type of experience that consumers want. But generally speaking, Row, Hims and Hers, I've seen them be successful, basically just saying, hey, you're losing hair, here's a pill to cure that. I think we're all pretty familiar with these companies. Where I will say some of these companies and more micro examples start to go awry, or areas that I think have been harder to succeed in are when they try to make a service at a consumer price point. There's been some moderate levels of success, perhaps in like the functional medicine space, but even for those harder to access, not typically reimbursed by insurance types of areas, the price point to make workable a services company just doesn't compute with the consumer. And they always want it in a way that, can't sustain your business model, right? Like if you have a monthly model, they're going to use up all their business in the first month and then duck out. If you have a per visit model, they're going to try to squeeze everything they can out of like the messaging. If you charge for messaging, they're going to say like, why did you charge me for a 1-word reply? So this place gets really hard in the services model. That's where I've seen companies go awry. And even the digital therapeutics, as the prescription digital therapeutics kind of were not doing so hot in the insurance-based go-to-market model. When they tried to pivot here, I haven't seen it work great. There is one in our space called Nerva. They have a different name now, that I've seen do moderately well and figure it out, but it's kind of few and far between. Direct-to-consumer insurance, I would just say, to differentiate, this is where you're fundamentally getting reimbursed by an insurance company. And I differentiate it from the health plan sales angle, because most of these companies are going through what I call the front door of an insurance company, right? So any provider, if you go through all the work, infrastructure, regulatory bodies to set up a PCMSO structure, so on and so forth, get providers licensed, you can just go get credentialed with a health plan and take rates, just whatever their, like, we call them rack rates are. So I can get reimbursed for evaluation and management. If you're a virtual provider, which is most of what we're talking about here in digital health, like you can start making money, I wouldn't say quickly, but it takes 6 to 8 months to get through these payer, credentialing arms, and you can get it reimbursed by insurance. It's doable. It's a lot of like front end administrative work, but totally doable. Companies, I'd say this is a more recent space to start to flourish. Companies like MIDI, Nourish, NoCD, I've seen do quite well here. They're all different models. At Oshi, we talk a lot about MIDI Health as being like really, really good at building brand and starting to acquire patients through some of these more traditional paid channels. What I'll say about it is the unit economics are hard. And you have to be really, really, really confident in the service you're providing and how that maps to insurance, what those reimbursement rates are going to be, and what that's going to mean for your unit economics. Typically, an out-of-the-box reimbursement rate for a visit is not enough to sustain most companies, right? So Nourish is dietitians, and they've kind of done some things to figure out that whole dietary space. NoCD, I didn't put some of the other behavioral health companies or therapists, like different models of owning versus providing a platform to clinicians, but they've made something work because there's stickiness and retention in the dietary and behavioral spaces. MIDI's done a really nice job of building brand and building some level of retention, but also figured out a way to build monetization models from other means too, to sort of supplement. So the thing I always say about this is like the unit economics are constrained, but if you can get big enough, if you can scale, you might be able to increase the rates. You may be able to find other ways to monetize. Typically, the reimbursement for a provider type model from just out of the box rates is not going to work. The only other thing I'll say on this space is at one point there was this idea of like, I'm going to go D2C with insurance and then I'm going to convert into, a different type of contract. I think Oak Street went from like the D2C to the health plan value-based care model, and that was successful for them. I find that really difficult. Any insurance company is just going to say, if you're doing well with the rates I've given you, like, why would I reimburse you more? And it's really hard to get to a scale at a national level to where they're actually going to increase your rates. So if you're betting on this channel for the prospect of eventually shifting to a different reimbursement model, I would heavily question that. I would say instead, figure out how to make it work as well as you can and think about other monetization streams, because getting the payer to give you more and pay you differently is a pretty big bet.
Okay. A few questions on both of these.
Yeah.
So on the first D2C / cash pay, I think one thing I wanted to just like share from my experience. So in the addiction medicine space, I worked at Bicycle for about 4 or 5 years, and Bicycle, the message was very clear. People wanted insurance to pay for what we were offering. So we started with near 100% cash pay, and by the time I had left, it was near 100% insurance pay. It was like this transition we did. That said, there are still companies in the space that are 100% cash pay, in the sense that they've kind of carved out that niche. Can you speak to that? Like that, it's not like there's one real solution. I will also say the companies that are 100% cash pay are smaller, so it's not like the market leader, but
I think
like multiple can survive.
It's a really great point, and it's hard to talk about healthcare because there's so many different niches and specialties that do not abide by the rules of others. Like when you're going out and raising money, and for example, you always want to be like, I'm going to be the X of whatever space you're in. And usually it's not apples to apples. So on the addiction, that's not surprising to me. Like, obviously that's an area where people who are struggling are very motivated, and there's a precedent as well for cash pay, right? Like you can go to clinics that don't accept reimbursement and pay a bunch of money and get a better service. So figuring out a way to make insurance work in that space is going to be a differentiator, but there is enough willingness to pay. And to your point, especially if you have a physical presence, like if you're trying to stay more local, you can it's harder, but you can have a lot more flexibility. Like if you know all the different players in the space and where patients go and build credibility and have a more guerrilla style marketing approach, I think you can be successful. Same thing with, therapists. Like if you're really good as a therapist, build word of mouth, like you can have a successful cash pay business for sure. It's harder when you're trying to scale that to a national base. But I'd say like know your area, right? Like addiction space is one where there's a precedent for cash pay. There's a willingness to pay. Folks are really struggling and looking for solutions. That's one of the exceptions to where you can probably make the service model work. Virtual is a little harder, perhaps, than having a physical presence where you can add more of the services that people want. But it's workable, especially on a smaller scale, to your point.
Okay. On the insurance D2C side, you kind of presented this as a little bit as like maybe an easy in quotes approach. My experience, again, maybe this has evolved, was just, so if you want to do like nationwide service, getting contracts by itself is like a multi-year process. That has been my experience in the sort of 2018 or to 2024 era. Is it gotten easier, or is it just as hard as it ever was? So, everyone knows there's like 10 payers in every state, and to get meaningful coverage, you have to get contracts basically every single one. And there's all this complexity. Everyone rejects you for different reasons and stuff like that. So is it easier, or is it still as hard as it ever was?
Yeah, easy is a relative term here. I mean, like, none of this is easy. None of healthcare is easy. I don't think it's gotten easier. In some ways, it's gotten harder as some of these health plans have really tried to cut back on administrative spend. And to be fair, we didn't, this wasn't our primary model, so I haven't experienced the mechanics in as much depth. The reason we didn't go about it is because we have behavioral health providers, dietitians, and advanced practice providers and MDs as well. So we would have to go, we'd have to get the behavioral health providers credentialed through the behavioral health arms, because most of that's outsourced. The dietary is its own, we had triple the complexity, and the reimbursement rates for what we're trying to do, and for GI specifically, were either not attractive or going to get denied. Like a dietary service, if you put a GI ICD on the claim code, it will get denied in most payers. Most of when I say easier, it's just it's a human power problem rather than I need to go do a strategic sale, which is what 3 and 4 often turn out to be. So the companies, from what I understand, they'll just go state by state by state. So it's if you can hire enough humans to spend enough time going through these credentialing arms. What has gotten easier than over the last 10 years is the acceptance of virtual care as a modality. If you were trying this pre-COVID, and we've had this problem, and you try to call up even a state licensing board, and then a payer in a specific state, they'll be like, where's your location? Even getting posted on the provider portal has been a struggle, because the entire infrastructure was oriented around, well, where's your location? And if you don't have a location, you can't even complete some of the forms. So that part of it has gotten quite a bit easier, that they'll say, okay, we accept a virtual only provider. You don't have to open up a PO box. Well, you do have to open up a PO box. You have to have something on the on the form, but it used to be that you'd have to fake the fact that you were leasing a medical office space. People would go through all sorts of hoops. So that part's gotten easier, and you can solve it with human power, just brute forcing your way through every door, all the forms, every payer, and then every payer in every state. So United, you can get a bunch of local contracts. Getting a national contract, much harder, requires some strategic force. Some of the plans have actually staffed people in a national provider contracting arena, because they recognize there's more companies like Oshi that are out there. So yeah, those elements have gotten easier. On the whole, it's probably gotten easier, but there's also just fewer administrative staff and more companies, creating a barrage of noise from all angles.
Yeah. I was one of my responsibilities at Verta in 2018 was to get us contracted with just as many payers as we could in the sort of front door approach. And I'd say 80% were basically telling us what you just said, which is where's your office? Oh, you're telemedicine. Yeah. Oh, we don't take you. And then 2020, 2021, kind of everything changed very quickly.
Real quick, I have one question about cash pay. And my question about cash pay is, my experience is I feel often I'll talk to companies will come to us talking about SEO, GEO, or I'll meet them at a conference. And when they're starting off, often what I'll hear is, well, we're going to start off cash pay, but then once we have proof of concept, proof of efficacy, like we'll quickly pivot into one of these other models here. And it always raises alarm bells in my head. Like it doesn't really sound like, I don't know. But then I hear, Chris, for you, you, for example, at Bicycle, you started out nearly 100% cash pay and then did, that's exactly what you did. So I guess my question is, am I right in my skepticism? Is that viable, or is that just like covering up for something else that they should be considering at their business?
I'd say again, the word easy would be like the biggest alarm bell.
Yeah.
In theory, anything's possible. I mean, I'd be curious of Chris's perspective. My understanding of Chris, your story was like, you didn't need the proof points you got from cash pay to get the insurance contracts. You just needed to like brute force your way in there, or were outcomes? Because I have a different answer for like what we did, which we just offered our service for free to gain proof points because we were trying to do a more strategic sale. But I don't think you have to do one to build outcomes to get to two. Maybe Chris, you have a different perspective on that though.
Yeah, I'll say one thing. When we were doing this, we would tell to ourselves, nobody has done this before. So we were aware that this was like not a likely scenario. That said, I do think, as Mike mentioned, addiction medicine is a little bit unique. There's a lot of direct intentful consumer demand for it. And there is a precedent of cash pay. So it's, at least at the time we were in the market, I think it's evolved. Offering insurance coverage was kind of like a bonus, not like a requirement. So I don't think everyone is like this. Like if you try to do it in primary care or something, it's not gonna fly, for example.
Yeah, and like the nature of when you went to get insurance, were they like, well, show us your outcomes so that we can gain confidence? Or
no, it was very front door kind of stuff. Yeah.
Right. So I mean,
like at this point it is, but yeah, it's evolved. So, to get any sort of thing like off the rack, or sort of not on the rack is what I mean. Yes, that would be part of the conversation. But
yeah, that's exactly the point I'm making, right? It's like on the rack, off the rack's good. Like if you want just off the rack rates, none of these like payer credentialing teams have anything to do about like quality or outcomes or savings. It's just like, okay, have you filled out the form correctly? Are there any, they'll do the background checks on all your providers, so on and so forth. It's not about quality really at all. And that's not what they're staffed to do. If your goal is to strategically sell, meaning I want some kind of customized contract, I want a value-based care arrangement, that's usually in like buckets 3 and 4. And for those, outcomes, savings demonstrations are super important. They're necessary. I mean, when we were going through all this, it was a different era where like companies like ours were getting funded left and right because it was like, that was the innovation in healthcare. At this point, much of that appetite and the associated dollars are going towards AI. So it's it's more difficult to do. But all that being said, like our idea was, well, let's just give this away for free to start. We need to get some experience. And like, then we had a really low price cash pay model just to see. We were kind of mimicking what a copay would do to consumer behavior, but all of it was just like, let's get 50 patients in the door, prove that like this produces better outcomes, and try to use that to sell into plans, which we ended up being very successful at least on a relative scale, but it took a lot of time and energy and would be more difficult to do today in the current funding environment than it was when we were doing it.
I have one more question, and I think we should probably move on to the sales-based approaches. So I have seen many companies, and I have made these spreadsheets myself, where you kind of look at all the rates and you're like, okay, if this goes well, it looks like we can get a pretty solid margin. And then, fast forward 2 years, you basically have given up because it's too hard to get those rates, or there's something you didn't calculate. I've just seen this so many times. So I think like the question is, how do you know with saving those 2 years, like the rates are actually going to work or not? You mentioned that generally the rates are too low, but when you look at them as a spreadsheet, they look attractive.
I mean, trust me. We've done this 10 times over. We did it as recently as like the last year because we were like, oh, something changed fundamentally. Ultimately, it kind of comes down to the assumptions, like which most people are too rosy on to start, and they just miss assumptions. Like, so that's what I would say, right? Minus the time, minus like all the energy it takes. You have to take any reimbursement rate. First of all, you're going to look at like CMS rates because those are public. A lot of people then say, oh, like, they'll find some stat and say, oh, commercial insurers reimburse on average 20% higher than CMS. Like, that's your first wrong assumption. You don't know that that's the case. You don't know what it looks like by payer. You don't know for sure whether or not like your particular codes, which are usually going to be evaluation and management codes or dietary, it's MNT codes, behavioral, there's a set of codes. So that's assumption number one to like be very weary of. Assumption number two has to do with like, well, how do they reimburse for virtual care and how do they reimburse for the level of practitioner that you're staffing? So like the typical rule of thumb for us was like, we're going to use primarily nurse practitioners, and physician associates are going to be the ones that are delivering most of the frontline care. It's going to be virtual. So there's like a 15% cut for virtual and then a 15% cut for using advanced practice providers instead of MDs. Now, companies have gone and done incident to billing and so on and so forth. There's ways to sort of work around this, but like you have to take into account that there's going to be cuts for those activities in particular. And then the final piece, there's assumptions around like in E&M, like, or MNT, like how much time are you going to be able to spend on average per patient? You know, is it what level of complexity? What code can we hit? Those are other assumptions that people get wrong. The last area, maybe two areas that people get wrong are, one is like the, what's it called? Bad debt. So how many claims are going to get denied? What's your collections going to be from patients? By the way, one thing that I haven't said explicitly, but should be clear by now, if you are banking on making money on chronic care management or remote patient monitoring billing codes, I would just say don't. Like, I'm a big non-believer in those codes. They're really cumbersome. It's like doable. It usually creates a lot of patient friction, whether you're billing through providers or trying to do it on your own. CMS is now coming down really hard on remote patient monitoring. I know for a fact our head of health plan sales came from United. He was basically shutting down any company that was using those codes. So I think the remote patient monitoring stuff, well intended to try to bring more solutions to patients, but like resulted in a lot of gamesmanship, low value services, if you even want to call it that, and a lot of now pushback from payers and ultimately CMS. So pick your codes wisely, but back to the point, like bad debt's a big one. Claim denials are going to happen. Patients won't pay out of pocket. You have to factor that in. And then just like the labor costs, right? So like, who are you paying? Usually the unit economic models. I always refer to Oshi. I called it a unit economic lasagna, because, you know, you start with like, oh, how much time to deliver the service? What's the reimbursement for the service? But what people usually, the next layer is like, well, what's the fully baked cost of the clinicians? And then all the semi-variable costs of the people around the clinicians to manage them. Like our original models on the cost side were just way overly rosy because we didn't take into account the fact that like, well, if a provider works 40 hours a week, they're only really going to be seeing patients for 32 of those hours, best case, because, you know, they have all this administrative work to do. And then of those 32 hours, we're going to lose time to missed visits, canceled visits, et cetera. People like to just say, oh, a visit takes 45 minutes. You know, I pay a clinician, you know, whatever salary per year, there's X minutes per year, divide that out, multiply by 45. And that's my unit cost. Like your unit cost is going to be triple, quadruple that in reality when you take into account all the stuff I just mentioned. So that was a lot, but like in short, you know, the reimbursement rates, the bad debt and the costs, people almost always model it wrong at the end of the day.
Yeah, I think what I'm hearing is like, you have to be, there's almost like, I think there's sometimes an assumption that like, just like insurance is made to be kind of profitable. And I think it is in a sort of very basic sense, like you're an individual provider, small office, you know, these can pay for your time. But if you're running a more complex operation, let's say even you're acquiring patients via some sort of paid channels, like it isn't really meant to subsidize those sort of things. And so,
no,
yeah, it just doesn't work. So unless they're, sorry.
No, and if you think about like a health system or any specialty group, I mean, they are not making money on office visits. They're making their money on the procedures, and the office visits are like a loss leader for the procedures. So
those are increasingly very difficult in a telemedicine context. So you're left with these like the things that people, lost lead off of. And you're probably acquiring patients in ways that cost more than others. So it's just like not a very attractive business, I think is probably the way of putting it. Maybe you can, like some people like just slog through and make it work. And as you said, there's some exceptions, like MIDI is a good example, but it sounds like they're doing other revenue streams also.
Yeah, MIDI's got, I don't know the details, but like they built a really good brand, and like now they have multiple avenues to monetize. I think NoCD and Nourish and some of the companies in their space have become profitable, but part of it, or at least they have a better chance to, like they tend to have really good retention of patients. The cost of a dietitian or an LCSW, which is usually, or even like lower level, you know, is cheaper than that of an MD or even the nurse practitioners. So like labor costs are lower. So they've figured out some margin that actually works out. And even still, it's pretty thin and requires a good amount of scale.
Okay, so we probably could assume that if you have a spreadsheet, you're probably wrong. I'm probably quite wrong on the math. That's always the case. Anyways, let's transition. We got to move on. So let's move on to these sales-based categories. So health plan sales, sometimes you refer to as the backdoor approach, and then employer sales. Can we talk about, like, I think these get like mushed together a lot. Oftentimes you see companies in quotes doing both at the same time, or like talking about doing both, or like it's always on the roadmap to do both of them. So, yeah, I can talk about them and talk about like why you would do one over the other and why one would be a good fit for a certain company and not the other.
Yeah, I mean, I would say like 3 health plan. We call it health plan B2B2C. That's kind of the holy grail that every company wants to get to. They want to get to this point where the health plan believes in them so much that they're willing to pay them more than they would otherwise pay off the rack rates, that they're willing to like cover all the costs on behalf of the consumer, so make it $0 cost for patients, and that they're going to like steer all of the volume to this provider. I can't tell you how many companies I've seen somewhere on their roadmap say something like, you know, we're going to do this, we're going to improve these outcomes, we're going to improve savings, and then, you know, the health plan is going to give us all their volume, and so our acquisition cost is going to be 0. And that basically never happens, with a few exceptions, right? And same thing on employer. Like if you go look at like Hinge, Sword, any of the companies, Livongo is the OG example, or maybe the company that shall not be named in some circles. Like they all basically say somewhere on their website, like, oh, we have all these employer customers, and then also, you know, we have all of these health plan customers. But the health plan customers are almost never putting them fully in network, or even putting them in their fully insured book where they own the risk. They're basically the health plans are acting as a sales channel because, you know, they have all these AEs who are trying to add value. And that can be really useful and add value. I'm nothing against it, but it's a different type of model. So just to distinguish between the two, when I say a health plan sell in this context, it means that the plan is putting you in network as a provider and giving you a different type of compensation arrangement than you would get as a rack rate. A lot of the VBC companies, value-based care companies, have been successful in this space. We're a bit of a unique case, so I'll describe what a lot of the others do. So like a lot of the companies that have been successful here, Time Care, obviously, really big one, awesome team, really, really great company, and obviously in a really important space. Others, like all of the kidney care companies, the Somatuses, you know, so on. And then a variety of the VBC primary care companies. Like there's nuances, you know, the Oak Streets of the world between all of them, but most of them are really competing to take on risk, meaning that the health plans say, okay, like cancer care costs us this much. I'm going to give you this budget to manage a population. That's very different. So you're not getting reimbursed for every patient that walks in the door. You're getting compensated to manage a population of patients that they are attributing to you. And your job from an acquisition standpoint is basically to get the right patients in and to save money on what would otherwise cost. Because at the end of the day, if that population costs more than it did last year, multiplied by some trend, like there's a lot of actuarial work going on here, you're on the hook. So while you're getting a lot of money up front and there's huge revenue potential for each deal because it's a population-based approach, if you don't acquire and actually drive the cost down, you're on the hook and you can lose a lot of money. So there have been companies that have lost a lot of money in these deals and gone belly up. It's basically like, it's kind of like operating as an insurance company, but with a much more robust services arm and usually a more specific population you're going after. This has worked really well in Medicare. These companies have done tremendously well, at least some of them. Some haven't. There's all the, coding games that have happened. So there's a lot of nuance in that space. But fundamentally, what's happening is the plan's reimbursing you differently, usually better, and like they're helping you acquire patients. In our case, we've been primarily in the commercial space. We've been able to get value-based, customized deals with most national health plans. And we've been able to prove a lot of value, and we're also then expanding into Medicare. But we thought we were going to take risk like those companies. GI is just a harder space to do it. There's less precedent. So we've worked out kind of this episode of care case rate approach, which has worked really nicely, although it has complexity. You have to know this space extremely well if you're going to be successful. You have to be working with increasingly limited resources on the health plan side. You have to fit their priorities. So it is really, and I'd say it's a strategic sale. Like, be very weary if you're trying to do this of someone who said they've done health plan sales at another digital health company, because it's not the same as what you're going to be looking for, or it's this kind of buy-up model. So huge potential here. If you can get it, it can make your business, but difficult for all the reasons that I stated. And like, you have to have a really, 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 really strong savings story. So this is where building outcomes, working with actuaries really early on is really important. Like, a lot of companies trying to do this have no actuarial expertise. There's some great, if you don't have to hire your actuaries anymore, there's great companies you can work with. Accorded's one that we really love. That will basically be like actuary as a service is what I like to call it. Help you with some of the VBC contracting, et cetera. So exciting, but difficult space. And then employer sales, credit to these companies. Like, I think when Livongo first started, hearing their stories, it was like they would go to these employer HR conferences and no one would have any idea who they were or why they were there. And now, like, there's, a whole cottage industry of conferences for digital health companies trying to talk to employers. So, and credit to the employers, because they were willing to innovate where the health plan was moving too slow. So I could talk about these for days, but the essence of this channel is like, easier to sell an employer generally than it is to get a health insurance company to put you in network. Employers, a little less sophisticated, more oriented towards caring about patient outcomes versus just, insurance claims and profitability off of insurance. But it's really inundated. I mean, there's lots of reports on like vendor fatigue, point solution fatigue, et cetera. Consolidation towards individual, aggregators, which, for the digital health company trying to solve a problem is a bad thing, because usually they're not going to market you the same way. So this space is getting harder. You have to be like in the top 5 of cost. You're not going to influence the large employers to care about something that isn't already on their radar. And there's a lot of players. So whereas like, in the DC space, you have to develop this proficiency in direct to consumer advertising, and it costs a lot, but you can control your own destiny. In this space, you need sales channels. You need to be going to conferences, maybe some LinkedIn presence, but like, you got to be consultants, brokers, aggregator channels, the employers themselves, the health plan AEs, right? There's multiple categories of people that you need to get on your team and on your side. So it takes a lot of energy. Companies who have done it well, Hinge, Sword, done really, really well. Companies that are in a more narrow space that kind of like default to this because they've seen it work for others are probably not going to do great. And at the end of the day, I also think it's like, this channel alone, very few companies have made successful businesses on this channel alone, because it's crowded, because it's hard to get the attention. Employers are pulling back on touch points left and right. And ultimately, like, you're at the whims of what the employers will or won't allow you to do. So if an employer, we had an employer who, before we, years ago, like, they would give every digital health company as many touch points as they wanted. So I could send 20 emails a year and 5 mailers and get a lot of enrollment. They pulled all that back. So like, now we work with that same employer. They give 4 touch points per vendor because their employees were complaining about getting too many emails. That can, like, if that happens at mass scale, like, that totally changes the dynamics. So, and there's some other nuances about like the reimbursement opportunity and things that employers will reimburse for that health plans won't, that can create some, I'll call it maybe arbitrage and reimbursement to value. But I think it's companies coming out that are primarily going after the employer space are largely not doing well, unless they are like this bigger aggregator solution. There's been some companies that are like, oh, we're going to be, the solution for all of your different vendors and create a marketplace. Some have been decently successful in that space. And if you have sales channels and relationships, that can be a big advantage. So Glenn Tolman can start basically anything and, do decently well in that space.
Okay. First, I was just going to ask, yeah, there's a lot here. I mean, this is very cool stuff. If anyone has any questions, please drop them in the chat. We can start addressing those as they come in. Before I jump in, Noah, do you have any questions you want to?
No, I say keep going. We got 20 minutes left and still a lot to get through. So
yeah, well, okay. You mentioned with the employers, like as long as you're not in the top 5 categories, you accept your noise. Can you, and also when you talked about the categories for the health plan approach, they were these very kind of classic categories like kidney disease, cancer. I would imagine there's like a top 5 categories there too. Can you talk about like how, like what are those categories? I guess, how do you know if you're one of them? Literally, what are they? And also for the health plan, like, is there a way of, I guess it just seems like a lot of people try a lot of things, but in the end, only a few things work. And if you look back on it, like you probably could have predicted what those ones were. How do you think about that?
I totally agree with that. And also, I don't know, I mean, to be fair to my earlier comment, like no one was thinking about GI at all when we first started. So chances are, if there are reports that, there's a top 5 category, there's already players in it. How to distill this down? So there's tons of reports, first of all. Like you can go look at, if you just type in like top 5 employer costs or health plan costs, ask about Medicare versus commercial, like you'll get a sense. I would say, at least in this space, like you have to have a really good thesis as to why you're going to be different and how you're going to actually save money. I would spend time, if you have some funding, like playing around with actuarial data and trying to marry that to like clinical models and see where there's some cost differential. That was our big unlock, was like patients were suffering, sometimes in silence. No one knew how to look at the claims data to articulate the spend well, and we were able to marry those two.
Could you look at the CMS models for the health plans, like what they're doing?
Oh yeah. Good point. That's the other one, right? So, so on the VBC side, like that. On the health plan side, there should be precedent if you're going to go after a VBC model. Like we kind of broke through the noise and created something novel, which was really difficult and time consuming, but ultimately worked. That's kind of the exception at this point. So if you go and look at what Medicare is doing, they have primary care, they have cancer care, they have kidney care, all of those, there are like, CMMI is producing like all these VBC models. There's opportunity in MSK with like the HIPNI bundles. You can go and find all the different bundled care and accountable care organization structures that exist from CMS. That is a pretty good starting point, even though, those models themselves have been difficult. Some have succeeded, some haven't. It gives you a little bit of a flavor, and it gives the Medicare Advantage companies and the plans like a precedent to look at. So if I were starting a company, that's what the kidney care companies did. Ultimately, that's what Time Care did in the cancer space. There's some nuances to why like Time Care worked and a lot of other companies in the cancer space didn't. So, you have to get the model right. You have to know where the savings are. You have to be entrenched in like the actuarial data. But at the end of the day, you have to index to a model. And if CMS doesn't have a model, you're going to have a real uphill battle to climb. If I were starting a company today, like I don't even look that deeply at it, but that access model that CMS came out with, that could be interesting if you can figure it out. I think the reimbursement rates are going to be really difficult, but that could actually get some traction.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I want to talk about this one last category, and then we can kind of pull this all together and talk about sort of like overall how you make this decision, or how you think about it altogether. So the last category is billing through the provider. This is different than the other 4. So can you speak to this one?
Yeah, well, I will say in the time since we developed this this framework and had this live discussion, there was a major shift here, which was that CMS came out and actually, I don't know if they actually banned it, but they made a very heavy stance against third-party companies billing through existing providers' TINs, which was a really interesting play. That said, there are multiple ways. You know, this is kind of a catch-all. What maybe just as a kind of procedure to what I'm about to say, every company in the digital health space at some point thinks about providers as an acquisition channel, right? So they're like, okay, like providers are going to refer to me, right? I mean, it's easy for us. Like we get patients in faster. We have multidisciplinary care. We do all these things that a typical GI provider doesn't do. And yet we have not been able to make provider referrals work yet. So like, it's another example where if you think you're just going to go and get providers to refer to you, I have yet to see a company build their business off of this as a primary channel. Maybe there's a few exceptions, but like it is really hard to activate provider referrals to get them to change behaviors. So what you really need to do is figure out how are you going to make yourself relevant? How are you going to add value to the provider groups that you want to work with? And health systems are different than PE-backed, they're different than mom and pop shops, but ultimately it needs to be easy to implement for them, and it needs to be something that they can't easily do on their own, or at least, you know, that they don't perceive that they can do it on their own. And it needs to have some kind of upside for them. Like simply having a better clinical service that treats patients better is usually not enough to move the needle, which is, you know, just a true reality. So the best company in this space that's doing it compliantly that is going to be really successful that I know of is called Vercora. A little bit like more niche, but they're doing really, really well. And they do cardiac rehabilitation virtually. So cardiac rehab is this service that is already reimbursed in standard rack rates. Like every MA plan reimburses for it. They reimburse well. And companies can't, like most provider groups can't easily do it on their own. So they've built this whole means of partnering with provider groups, adding ancillary services that the provider groups don't want to staff, and leveraging technology that can easily plug into EMR with forward deployed engineers. And then it goes to their EMR and says, hey, here's all the eligible patients. We're going to like send the outreach, which they have that leverage of like flagging referrals and having messages that come from the provider, and then get folks enrolled in cardiac rehab. They provide the ancillary services so that the cardiac rehab is happening, so that the reimbursement is happening. And then because it's all under the provider's MPI, like they are going to be billing for, they can figure out, you know, some kind of like economic split that's compliant and doesn't have any kind of anti-stark issues. That's a really, really good and niche model. And, you know, one of the biggest through lines through all of this conversation is just like really understanding your area, your market, your consumer audience, what the health plan is going to think, what the employer is going to think. If you have a really good grasp on these things, chances are you can, well, maybe not chances, but you'll have a better shot at like figuring out the right path. So this is an example of a company. I know the founders, like these were all industry veterans who had been through a few different iterations, really sharp, really in the weeds, spent time in the actual clinicians' offices, like really got deep enough to understand, okay, this is a real opportunity, and they're thriving there. Some of the other companies that are just going and providing chronic care management and RPM services built to the provider TIN, I think it's just a brutal model. Like you create a lot of patient abrasion. It usually doesn't add patient value. You're basically trying to do things to hit a reimbursement code, not as much to solve the patient's problems. It's sort of the game that ends up getting played, not to say that's the intention. And payers are now all over it. Payers are just like, this doesn't add value. It's adding up costs. Patients get surprise bills. It's like, you know, you mark it, oh, we're going to send you like a scale for free or whatever. And then the patient scale, you know, stands on the scale once, it gets digitally conveyed, and a patient gets charged, you know, $60 copay, and they're like, what is this, right? So it's stuff like that that I think ends up being really challenging, and that, you know, now CMS is starting to clamp down on. There's other companies, by the way, who are like just going and staffing nurse practitioners to do virtual care and billing through that model. We have an offering called Access Plus that we're starting to do that sort of thing and starting to figure out ways to add value. You know, I know other companies have figured out their own unique flavor of trying to like have some kind of skin in the game version of mutually treating patients and referrals and all that stuff. So it can work, but you have to figure out the nuances and pick the right model. And it's a little fewer and further between than some of these others, at least today.
Mm-hmm. All right, let's back up. Let's pull this all together. No, any reactions to all of this?
Well, a few like outstanding questions that I have. Like one way that I think is interesting for me to try to follow this story and this conversation is through your experience with Oshi, obviously, and because it sounds like in building Oshi, you figured a lot out, but also at the same time, like the companies change, and any digital health company, you're changing as you grow, but then also at the same time, the market and the landscape is changing at the same time, right? So one question I have is, if you could do Oshi again, like in the time travel version of the question, going back in time with all the knowledge you have today, what's something you would have done differently?
Ooh, such a good one. We did everything perfectly, and there was no. No, I'm just kidding. It's such a unique model. If I could go back, I would have started building the direct-to-consumer and brand side earlier. And I would have started building that muscle and that proficiency sooner, because especially in the world and where we're going, I think that is like the true differentiator, one of the true differentiators. If you win over consumers, I mean, people are going to go to AI for answering questions. There's no stopping that train. But when folks get to a point of wanting something more and needing an actual clinical model because they want a prescription or a lab, or feel that level of advice is more useful to them than what they can get out of the models, the AI models, like you want to be that solution. You want to have that perception. So that's something that I would have done differently. It's difficult when you're just starting to scale, but it would have been possible even with the first contract that we got, which was with United in some of the states that we were in. So for us, like,
go ahead. Oh, you.
No, go. Yeah, like
I mean, I see. I think that's so interesting, because very often any company that's exploring a B2B2C approach for SEO, AI search, anything organic, they come to me with that question of like, does it even make sense for us? Like, how important is the brand? And that's like such one of the more definitive answers I've heard on the pro side of that.
Yeah, what I'll say is, if your only route is through employer, don't do that, because the employer, like, no one thinks about healthcare in the context of like, does my employer provide this as a benefit? They think about healthcare in the context of, does my insurance company reimburse this? So we were fortunate enough to be able to prove enough value to get in-network contracts, not buy-up contracts. That's what made it feasible for us. We bet pretty big on, there's a nuance that I'll articulate now, which is like, if you want to get reimbursed by insurance companies in any way, strategic or otherwise, unless it's these, like, except for these, full risk deals, the first monetization is going to be almost always on a visit event. If you're going through employers, you can do something a little trickier. You can say, oh, someone signs up and they fill out an intake form, and we send them something, and like, that's the activation event. And by the way, that costs $600 and covers the first 3 months. Insurance companies are going to look at it and say, like, that's BS. I will never reimburse for that. Like, we see a huge drop off from the time someone like creates an account and shows enough intent to do that, and maybe reads one of our articles or whatever, to first visit. So that creates a huge gap in potential monetization. And with that, like, the employer opportunity is great, but it's less. So the way I always think about it is like, employers are great, health plans, they have all sorts of legal constraints that prevent them from actually steering volume. If you can get them, great, but they're not sufficient. I don't want to rely on some third party to be able to drive growth. I need to build the muscle and the consumer share of voice to be able to bring patients in that way.
Super interesting.
What? I think that we've talked a lot. I think a lot of people look at this space and just conclude everything is hard, which is true. But at the same time, every few months someone breaks through. Like there's new things. Like it's not like there's nothing happening. I guess what I'm trying to thread the needle here is like, I don't want people to leave just say like, oh, this is all impossible, everything's taken, because I don't think that's true. But at the same time, you do have to be really careful and sensitive about the approach. So I guess my question is, like, what do you see now in terms of opportunities in this map that we've mapped out? Like, what are you excited by in the next few years of what you think we'll be seeing more of in terms of successful companies?
I think at this point, one of the two of direct to consumer is pretty interesting. Like, if we were talking about this 4 years ago, MIDI would have like barely existed, and even Nourish and those companies would have been smaller. I think that if you can control your own destiny and not rely on some strategic buyer to make a decision, that is ultimately a more attractive model. I remember talking to like one of my friends who's an investor in digital health at one of like the, really strong VC companies. And he said, if you can't make your economics work on fee for service, meaning like some iteration of rack rates, we're not interested. And the wisdom of that point was like, take time, care, and those companies aside. His point was like, it needs to be clear and obvious. You need to be able to control your own destiny. You need to be able to build the business and not rely on some strategic deal coming through. And like it worked for us. I think we did a uniquely good job at certain things and not so good at many other things, but it's difficult to like create something out of nothing with a health plan buyer. So if you can find a condition area of folks who are underserved and make your unit economics work well enough, once you get the consumer brand, like there are other monetization channels, there are other things that you can explore. You can make a really attractive business, and it's the profitable growing companies that are like, I think services companies are kind of out of favor a little bit right now. I think it'll swing back, but if you have scale and a path to profitability, like you're doing really, really well. So those are companies I'm really excited about. Some of the more recent ones I've talked to, like I think Neuro Health in the neurology space is really cool. Like there's some companies in the autism space, and some of them with really bad clinical quality, but like adult autism, like look at what's taking off, look at what people are interested in. I mean, I don't, clinical quality aside, all the stuff going on in peptides, et cetera, like there's consumer audience and appetite for things that the current healthcare system is not providing super well. And if you can make some of your money on like the reimbursement side and have that as the bonus and thing to draw someone in, and find other ways to monetize over time, and you build a consumer audience and brand that is paying attention to you, that's a winning strategy. And then, I haven't read enough into it, but the Access model from CMS could be interesting. So there's niches and nuances that are very interesting, but you got to be in the weeds and really understand these different avenues well. Spend time with the providers, try to get as much depth as possible.
Would you say that it's moved generally in this direction over like the 10 or 15 years you've been watching it? Like,
I think
you would recommend it should be more in this sort of start consumer focused company more so now than prior?
I think so. Yeah. I mean, the health plans and the employers, like they're great partners. We've been really grateful for and appreciative. We've had awesome people working with us. And at the same time, like there's just so many constraints on their attention that it's really difficult to have the runway to build a business that relies on them solely. And it's not, I talked about how it's really hard to go from the D2C insurance company front door to the other side. Like it is. And also it is possible. It helps get you in the door. At this point, like you just can't finance a company. I used to say we're kind of like a biopharma. Like we're building this instead of a pharmaceutical product, we're selling a new clinical model, and we need to prove that out and get these reimbursements. Like I think that's really hard to do, to get the funding and the runway to do that today. And so you got to figure out a way to build scale, build the consumer audience, be close enough to profitable, lower your burn. But there's still so much that needs to be solved for patients. And at the end of the day, like if that problem exists, there are businesses that can, should, and will exist. You just got to find the pocket of, reimbursement models and partners that make it work to get to scale.
Cool. Well, with that, I think we can end things. No, anything else to add?
No, I just wanted to say thanks so much, Mike. This was like a head-spinning conversation in a good way. So I appreciate you putting in the years of work to be able to consolidate it down to an hour, although we probably could have gone a few more. So we'll have to.
Yeah, no, I always feel like it's like gotten it simpler, but it's still complex. Sometimes that's just the nature of healthcare. But I love this stuff. I'm super passionate about it. As hard as it is, like I'm as big a believer as ever that the right models will find their way to success. If you're solving a patient problem and truly solving it, like there is a pathway. You just got to find it.
Love it. Love the ending on optimism. Mike, where should people follow you, be in touch with you? LinkedIn, anything like that?
Yeah, LinkedIn's a great channel. And yeah, I'm generally, if I can find it in my calendar, very open to discussions, love meeting new companies, helping however I can. So please, folks listening, feel free to reach out.
All right. Well, fantastic. Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Chris, as always. We will be recording another one of these tail end of August, early September, all about the future of search. So I'll do a lot more talking that time, which will be exciting for me. Looking forward to that. Thank you all for tuning in. We will see you next time.
Awesome.
Bye.
Thanks, guys.
Bye.